Today's daf we're going to be learning is Sanhedrin Daf Mem Zayin. Today's daf is dedicated in honor of the release of Yardain B. Bas Ofer Calderon and Keith Siegel after 484 days in captivity. May we see the speedy release of all the rest of the hostages. Okay, with that, wishing everyone a Shavua Tov. There's a study guide for today, at least for the first part of the daf. And we're going to get started where we were in the middle of a sugya. Yesterday, at the end of the daf, we asked a very interesting question. I actually want to go to two questions back, which is the first question about is Kvura Mishum Bizione, who is the reason why we bury people in order to prevent humiliation to the body, or is it because of kapara for atonement? And I quoted then Rashi, who talked about how putting the body deep in the ground is kind of, a sort of not exactly humiliation, but bringing things down is a way of atoning. But there are others who really described it in a way that I understood a little better, which is the idea that it's going back to the ground where Adam Rishon was created from the ground, and it's a sort of way of bringing atonement by returning the body to where it was first created, and maybe that's part of the issue of the atonement. It's not what I wanted to point out is it's not 100% clear about how burial exactly causes atonement, although we're going to come back to this idea later in today's daf on Abaye. Then we had another question, which is a very, very relevant question because this comes up at lots of funerals. As we said, for example, the Gemara even said that what if somebody doesn't want to be eulogized? Do we eulogize the person anyway? Because is the eulogy for the person, the deceased, or is it for the family? And even if you don't get to that situation where somebody says, I don't want to be eulogized, in general, it's a question when people write their eulogies, what am I doing this for? Am I doing this for myself, for my family, or am I doing it for the deceased? So we had 4 attempts yesterday. Now we're going to have altogether 9 attempts. Only the last one is going to be successful. And each time we're trying to first assume that it is for the dead person, okay, for respect for the deceased and not for the family. But each time we're going to explain the source could be understood in the other way as well. So starting at the top of our daf, Tashma, Nivze be'enav nimas. It's a very hard pasuk to translate literally, but there's a bunch of different ways to translate the simple reading of this verse. It's a pasuk from Tehillim. We're going to explain it like this. Someone who belittles himself in his own eyes and is despicable or does something despicable, or made himself look despicable. And this is Chizkiyahu. What did Chizkiyahu do that made himself look despicable in a way or do something that's humiliating? Zeh Chizkiyahu Melech Yudahu, if you remember, was a good king, but his father Achaz was a terrible king, did not go in the ways of God. And because he did not go in the ways of God, when his father died, Shigirer Atzmot Aviv Al Mitasha Chavalim, he dragged the bones of his father on a bed of rope in order to humiliate his father in his death. So what does this sound like? If it was for now again, we're going to talk about the concept of what one's supposed to do at a burial. We're kind of leaving a little bit the hesped issue, and we're talking more about the treatment of the person with respect would be for the person himself, and that would explain why he did this, because this person didn't deserve that respect. This person was a terrible king, and because of that, he didn't deserve it. So that's why he dragged Chizkiyahu dragged the bones of his father, who was a terrible person. It must be because this is more the focus of the way you behave with the dead body, which for a good person will be good, and for a bad person will be bad, humiliating. Has to do with the focus on the person, because if it's for the relatives didn't sin. Chizkiyahu was a great king. Why would Chizkiyahu humiliate himself if the purpose of eulogies and the treatment is for the people alive? Well, if the people are alive are good, then you should have good treatment of their ancestors, even if they're terrible people. So my timer. So then, right, what would be the reason to do this? So which the answer, no. He could have had a different reason to do this. It wasn't to humiliate his father because the treatment at the funeral is really for the deceased. He wanted his father to get atonement. This is going to be a big theme in today's daf about how one gets atonement. Okay, as I said already, people say the burial itself is atonement. What else is atonement? Well, he wanted to humiliate the father's body in death in hoping that that would atone for his father's sins. This, by the way, was very similar to what we saw in a few dapim ago in that long story in Rashi, where the rabbi was mistreated at the funeral, and he said that was because I did something wrong in my lifetime, right? I didn't rebuke people, and on account of that, right? That provided atonement because he ended up in Gan Eden. Remember, he was in heaven. And because of that, right, because he got atoned in the humiliation at his death. So basically, he wanted atonement. So now, Mishum kapara da'avua mashele liyakara Yisrael. So now they say, wait a minute. We want to get atonement right now. We're looking for atonement for, he's looking for atonement for his father. Chizkiah wants his father to get atonement. And that's why he did this, and it has nothing to do with, or is the focus on the family, is the focus on the deceased. It was a side issue. He wanted to provide atonement. But if you're saying now that it's not for the father, it's for the deceased, it's for the family. And in this case, since he was king, the family is all of the Jewish people. So now we're going to say Chizkiah dragged his father's bones in front of, right, the people's side. Humiliating, if the whole thing is the focus is on the family, and in this case, all of the Jews. So, Mishum kapara da'avua mashele liyakara Yisrael. He's going to basically push off and say, I don't care about the respect that all of Israel deserves because this was their king. I'm going to humiliate him in front of everyone as humiliation for the people, really. It's a huge humiliation for them. We're allowed to do that because he wanted atonement for his father. That allows you to push off this whole issue of respecting the nation. To which they answer, yeah, it's okay because, not because really you could do that, but Yisrael gufayim nichale de machale yikarayu legabe. Since they all viewed Achaz as their family kind of thing, because he was their king, it's actually in the best interest of the Jewish people to have their king, who was a terrible person, be humiliated in order to get atonement so that their beloved, right, their special person would get atonement. Meaning it was in the best interest of Chizkiah, is the best interest of the Jewish people, and therefore there's no conflict here. But in any case, this didn't prove anything because we could say it was for Achaz that they did it, and we could say it was for the respect of the family and all of Israel. So it doesn't prove anything. Tashma, next source. Now we're going to have a source of Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi. Before Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi dies, he tells the people, Amar lahem, al tisbeduni ba'ayarot. Don't have small groups of people gathering together to do hespedim for me. I want one big funeral. Everybody to come to the big city. If it's for the people, what's the difference? If they get together in their cities and eulogize, or they get together in one big place? Must be, Rebbe felt that for his respect, he wanted everyone to be together, and therefore it would prove again respect for the deceased. Kasavar litiakru be Yisrael tfei. No, it wasn't for his own sake, and especially if you say he was humble. You know what he says? I want a big funeral. No, the issue was he thought it would be more respectable for the Jewish people if they all got together. It would be a showing of respect, and it would actually be for them a better way of doing it. Doesn't prove anything. Tashma, next source. Helino lechvodo. Remember, we learned you cannot push off a funeral. You have to do it that day. We learned it from the person who gets stoned, who then gets hung. By the way, this question, it'll be posted later today, about the whole thing, is the funeral for the deceased or not, is the topic of Daf Mishalahem this week of Rabbanit Shiur and Chamuta. So Helino lechvodo. Now we push off a burial. For what reason? For what reason are we allowed to push off a burial and not bury on that same day? Lahavilo aron v'takrichim. What if you need a coffin or you need the shrouds and you don't have? So you're allowed to do that. Eino aver. There's no problem of lo talin. Okay, the negative commandment in the Torah, don't leave the body, is not relevant in those cases. My lav lechvodo shalmeit. So doesn't this seem, why would you need the aron and takrichim? Is it not for the, right, we're allowed to basically not bury the body today because in the body's best interest, right, it's better for the deceased to have the coffin and the shrouds. To which they say, lo, lechvodo shalchai. No, you could say it's for the family. For the family to have a respectful funeral without a coffin, without the shrouds, it's not respectful. Again, they asked a similar question they asked in the first source today. Wait, because we want to respect the people who are alive and have them buried properly, because it will be respectful for them, we're going to push off and disgrace this dead body by not, right? We're going to leave the dead body overnight. That seems really not right. Yes, it's true. We are allowed to do that. Why? And you could still explain it's for the family. Why is that? Ki amar Rachmana lo talin nivlato ala eitz. Remember where the source is, and that's why I said it a minute ago. The source is when the person who gets stoned then needs to get hung. And then they say, Ki amar Rachmana lo talin nivlato ala eitz. And then we say from there we get to everybody. Jumia de taloi de ipe bisayon. It's the whole issue of lo talin has to be that you're doing it in a way that's disrespectful for the dead body, like leaving it hanging, right? That would be disrespectful. So, aval hacha, in this case, delately bizayon lo. The reason you're pushing it off is not a disrespectful thing. It's not out of disrespect. It's not because I have better things to do with my time and I don't really care about the dead body. It's because I don't have the coffin and the shrouds, which is in the end from my family, for the respect for the deceased. But it's not that I'm disgracing the deceased by saying, I don't care, I'm just going to leave it hanging outside. No, only if you do it in a way, and this already, if you understand it this way, it really limits this whole thing. And I see people are writing in the chat that sometimes the Chevra Kadisha doesn't allow you to push it off. And there's all sorts of reasons where they do and don't. And different Chevras have different approaches, because as we know, right, we're learning Gemara, there's lots of different opinions. So different Chevra Kadishas are more makpid or less makpid. Sometimes the family is very careful, very strict about it. Sometimes, there's all different reasons why there would be different opinions. But here what we're saying is, as long as it's not doing it in disrespect for the dead body, but for a positive reason, then it's not even, there's no isur of lo talin. Okay, and that's why. And then in the end, you could still prove here that it's for the family and not for the deceased. Tashma, eighth source. It could be very similar to the previous, but it's going to have a few extra words that are going to seem to be a clear indicator. Heli, but I already told you there's 9 and only the last one is going to be proven, so we're going to reject this one as well. Helino lechvodo, okay, again, you leave over the body overnight for the respect of the dead body, or l'shem alavayarot, to bring people from the small towns to the funeral, la'avilo makonenot, there were makonenot, those were the women who would cry and sob, they would bring people, they even hired them, if you remember, we learned that from the parak about hiring someone and then they don't show up and it's a funeral and it's a timely issue, and what do? What's your right as someone who hired them? Lavilo aron v'tachrichim, to bring the coffin or the shrouds. Eino over alav shekolo sekin eino ela lechvodo shel met. Now here we say, just like in the previous, this is not a problem of lo talin, but why? Because anyone who does this is only doing it for the respect of the dead. Now, what do you see? It's for the deceased. Seems pretty clear. But no, because hachi kamar. Because this is how you read that line. When it's said in that source, it's lichvodo shel met, right? Whereas the previous source, it never said why. Here it says it's for the respect of the deceased. It sounds very clear. But now you could read it as ki hachi kamar kol haoseh lichvodo shel chai ein bo bizayon lamet. When it says it's lichvodo shel met, what it really means is it's not disgraceful for the dead body. Meaning that if you're doing it for the family, that is defined as not disrespectful for the deceased. But it doesn't mean the whole thing is for the deceased. It's just, again, there's no prohibition of lo talin if it doesn't have disgrace to the dead body. Okay? And that's how they understand lichvodo shel met, differently than we thought before. So last and final source, and here we will have a conclusive proof. Tashma Rabbi Natan Omer, Siman Yafeh Lemet, Shenifraim Mimenu L'achar Mitan. This again gets to this idea we're going to get to later, that if a deceased gets punished after death, okay, we'll see what that means, but something bad goes on for this deceased after death, it's a good sign, meaning it's a sign they received atonement. Like, for example, and this is the key one for our purposes, Meit Shelo Nispad. If for some reason there were no eulogies, okay, something happened and we talked about this before. A troop of soldiers come in, of enemy come in, and they just, quickly bury the body or something, which we'll see some case coming up later, and they end up with no eulogies at all. Vilo nikbar, or wasn't buried. O shechayag or an animal dragged the body. O shayug shamim misalvino misato, or rain was getting on the coffin. Zeu siman yafeh lemet. This is a good sign for the deceased, because it's a sign that the body is being atoned, the deceased is being atoned for. What do you learn from here? Well, the line about the hesped was very clear. If the person isn't eulogized, that's actually bad for the deceased, which means it's not for the family, it's for the deceased. It's very clear, because that in and of itself will atone, because the person should have been, it's like they got a punishment, and that punishment atoned for their sins. So, Shma Mina, Yakar Deshachvehu Shma Mina. From here, we can definitively conclude that it's for the deceased. Okay, so in the end, if you're struggling on trying to figure this out, right? Like I see Ruth is writing about a funeral that someone insisted on no eulogies and they honored his wishes, and that happens a lot. And it is good to side on that side, as we see from the sugya. even though it's not always so simple to do that. Lo hayu kovlin. Now we get to the fact that there were separate burial areas for people who were niskal and nisraf, right? They got stoned and burned, and there was another one for the people who got strangled and killed by the sword. So we have these two cemeteries that were specifically meant, or two burial areas that were specifically meant for people who had gotten death by the court. So kol kach lama, why'd they do this? Lafisha ein kovrim rasha itzel tadik, because you can't bury an evil person next to a righteous person, and that's why these people have to go into their own cemeteries. And if you remember what happens after the flesh is disintegrated and it's just bones, later on they would move the bones back to the graves of their families. We'll get back to that soon, why that is. If you can't bury them, then how do you bury them later? So we'll get back to that again. Hint being things I've already mentioned, that we're going to get into this atonement process that happens to a deceased when they get killed. So now we're going to say, Ein kovrim rasha itzel tadik. Okay, how do we know? There's this concept that you don't bury a righteous person next to an evil person. Ta'amar Rabbi Acha bar Chanina minayin she'ein kovrim rasha itzel tadik. He said, how do we know this? What's the source? Shene'amar vehi hen kovrim ish. This is a story in the time of Elisha, actually past the time of Elisha. He was dead already. And they're burying a person. And then they saw this gdud. Okay, I told you we'd get to this. They saw like an army of people coming by. So what did they do? They just vayeshlichu et ha'ish bekever Elisha. They just threw him into the grave that was nearby. It happened to be Elisha's grave. Vayelach vayigah ha'ish ba'atzmot Elisha. So the person, the body, goes and touches the bones of Elisha because they threw it and it obviously rolled over. Vayichi vayakam al raglav. And the person comes back to life and stands up on his feet. So what do you see here? Why did that happen? It must have happened because you can't bury a Rasha next to Tzaddik, and he was a Rasha. And because he was a Rasha, they didn't want his body buried next to Elisha. Okay, that's the story. So now they say, Vidilmali kiyume vihina shnayim beruchacha elai. Maybe it was to fulfill a different verse. Maybe there was a different reason. Maybe it had nothing to do with a Rasha and Tzaddik. But when Elisha, before Eliyahu dies, Elisha begs of him, Vayihina pishnayim beruchacha elai. I want to get double the ruach that you have, double the power that you have. Now, what is double? So Eliyahu brought one person back to life, and Elisha brought one person back to life, but Elisha asked for double. So maybe this body coming back to life was a fulfillment of that request he had of Eliyahu. Amar le, and then it doesn't prove anything about a Rasha not being buried next to a tzaddik. To which they respond, Amar le, says back to him, the Rabbi Acha bar Chanina answers, there's a bright about this. What is it, darshan, in that pasuk? It says that the person stood up on his feet. Okay, this dead body gets up on his feet. Now, the question is what happens to him after? If you say Elisha brought someone back to life, then we would see he had life after. But we don't see that. It just says, Vayakam al raglav. And then the Braita about this says, Amad, al raglav amad, uleveto lo halach. He got up on his feet, but he didn't go home. He didn't live after that. He just got up on his feet, moved over to a different grave, and buried himself there. And the whole thing was just to move him away from the kever of Elisha, which proves my point. Ella. So now we just have a side question. Vihina pishnayim hechem mishkachala. So where did, right, the achie, where do we see that he brought someone back to life? A second time, right? We have the boy that he brought back to life, but we don't have another story. Amar le Rabbi Yochanan sheripat sarat naaman shehi shkula kemet. Remember, he healed Naaman. We talked about this not so long ago. And a tzarat, someone who has mitzora, okay, we're going to quote Miriam twice today. Dichtiv al nati kamet. That's what they say about Miriam. Don't be like a dead person, right? That was the tefillah. So al nati kamet, we see that tzarat is like a med, and this comes up many, many times in Shas, that we view someone who is leper as a dead person. And the fact that he brought Naaman back and cured him of this disease was like reviving him from the dead. So that just answered the side question. In the end, we have this proof that tzaddik can't get buried next to a rasha, which explained to us the halach in our Mishna that we had separate burial spots for these people. Now they ask one other question. Well, first they point out one other thing. It's not just rasha etzel tzaddik. It's also, notice what we have, two cemeteries, one for the nisrafin and niskalin, and one for the nechnakim b'nei ragim. So what do we learn? Kach ein kovrim rasha chamor. It's a rasha kal. A severe rasha who did something that's the two higher ones, right? We have a debate about the order of severity of the deaths, but everyone agrees that skil and treifa are more serious than hereg and chenek. So we learn that from there. And that's how we know also that you have to divide in terms of hierarchy of serious offenders and a little less serious. I mean, they're obviously serious, they're also getting the death penalty, but less severe. So then they say, if you didn't say that, why don't we have 4 cemeteries then? If there's a hierarchy here of deaths, maybe we should have separated them each. Etc. So they say we have a tradition. Most people think that even means halacha l'moshe Sinai, right? It's been passed down from Sinai that there's basically 2 cemeteries here and not 4, and that's why we do 2. Now we're going to get into a whole other sugya, which is in the end going to get back to our topic, but right now we're going to get off topic a little bit, and it's going to get back to this atonement issue, atonement in death, but not yet. So we're going to quote two different rabbis. We're going to bring a tradition of Rabbi Yochanan. Amar Ula, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, Achal chelev, v'hifrish korban v'himir dato v'chazar bo. Okay, so we have a bunch of stages. Someone eats chelev by accident. They don't realize chelev is forbidden. They eat it. It's the forbidden fats of animals. There's certain fats that are forbidden because if you were bringing it as a sacrifice, they would burn them on the altar. In a regular animal, they're forbidden to eat. If you ate it and didn't realize, and then you find out, you have to bring a sin offering. So this person separated a sin offering, an animal, said this animal is going to be for my sin offering, but then they decide to leave the religion. And they leave the religion. Now, once you leave the religion, you're called a rasha, and you're not allowed to bring sacrifices because there's a pasuk that says, Zevach Rishaim Toeva. The sacrifices of a rasha is despicable by God. God doesn't want a rasha's sacrifices. So this person can no longer bring this animal as a sacrifice when they're not Jewish, right? When they're still Jewish, but they're a rasha because they decide not to be Jewish, right? There's no such thing as denouncing your Judaism. You're still considered Jewish, but the sacrifice will be pushed off. You won't be able to use this animal for a sacrifice. Okay, you wouldn't want to anyway. You've left the religion. But chazarbo. But then this person decides to come back to religion. And now when they come back to religion, the question is, can they use that animal as a sacrifice? To which Ula says in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, ho'il v'nitcha yidache. Since this animal, right, usually something that's sanctified to God and then is pushed off, it's called dachoi, it's rejected, it can never go back to being accepted. So you cannot use the sacrifice again. So the animal, basically, usually what you do is you leave the animal to die. There's nothing else you could do with this animal because it's got sanctity to it, but it can't be brought as a sacrifice, even if the person decides to come back to religion. And in a similar vein, Itmar Nami, it was also said, Amar Rabbi Yirmiyah, Amar Rabbi Yavau, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, different people bringing down the tradition of Rabbi Yochanan. Achal chelev, refresh korban, same thing, you ate chelev, you separate an animal. And then nishtata, then you became a shoteh. Now a shoteh is someone who can't bring, right, someone who goes insane, cannot bring a korban. V'chazar v'nishtafa, but then you became back to being sane. Ho'il v'nitcha yidache, same thing. Since there was a time where you couldn't bring the sacrifice, you can't bring it ever again. Tzricha, why did you need Rabbi Yochanan to say this in both these cases? Well, if you just had the first, you would say, Mishum the person decided not to be Jewish anymore, pushed off, right, caused it on his or her own. But the person who went insane, it was beyond their control. It just happened to them. You might have said, maybe it was like they were sleeping that time period, right? Even if it was 5 years, let's say, but maybe it was as if they were asleep that time period. Well, 5 years might be a problem. You can't bring the animal. The animal has to be a certain age. But let's say a few months. Maybe we'll just say it was like they were sleeping. Now, if you had it in the case of the shoteh, you might say a different reason, different perspective. Well, it's not in their control to come back. So maybe once it's pushed off, it's really pushed off. But the person who left religion could always come back anytime. They can always say, oh, I decided to be Jewish again. So you might say then, maybe it wasn't real dichoy. Maybe it wasn't really pushed off because it was always in their power to come back. Therefore, tzricha. So in both cases, you needed this to learn that it was pushed off. Okay, that's the beginning part of the sugya. Now it's going to get a little complicated because we're going to have a back and forth. What we're going to have is Rav Yosef is going to try to prove this halacha of Rabbi Yochanan from somewhere else. So far, we had 2 statements of Rabbi Yochanan really saying the same idea. We had to explain why do we have 2 statements saying the same idea, and we explain what's unique about each one. That part we can put aside for right now. Comes Rav Yosef, he's going to try to prove this from another source. Then Abaye is going to come and reject it. Rava is going to come and support, and then Abaye is going to reject Rava. Okay, so we're going to have Rava and Rav Yosef on one side and Abaye on the other. Okay, so let's see how this goes. Rav Yosef says, Af ananami tanina. I'm going to bring up a support for Rabbi Yochanan from a Braita. Hayuba Kodashim. We're now in Ir Hanidacha. We have a city where all the inhabitants are supposed to be killed because they all worshipped Avodah Zarah. They worshipped idols. All their property gets burned, but not if they have animals that are sanctified. We're not going to burn them because those don't belong to the people of the city anymore. They belong to God. So someone's designated an animal for sacrifice, and they happen to be an inhabitant of an Ir Hanidacha that's going to be destroyed. Hayuba Kodashim. If among the property of this Ir Hanidacha there were sanctified animals or sanctified property, if it was Kodshim Mizbeach, if they were meant to be sacrificed on the altar, like animals, Yamutu, they have to be left to die. You can't do anything else with them. If they were Kodshim Bedekabayit, they were things that people gave to the temple treasury, so Yipadu, we redeem them, and then they can be given to the temple treasury. That doesn't interest us right now. Now, Rav Yosef says they asked a question on the source, Amay Yamutu, why did they die? Kevan de Iktal, Havi Lagu Kapara, Velisku Lagavoa. Theoretically, right? So it's Zevach Rishaim Toeva. These are evil people. So because they worship idols, their sacrifices should be burned, but they should be left to die. You can't use them. But if these people did tshuva, right? Because when they get killed, their death atones. Now we're getting back to this topic. It should say then they should be able to be given as sacrifices now because they're animals that they designate. They're no longer Rishaim, right? They're now tzaddikim because they got atonement in their death. So the reason why they can't be brought as sacrifices must be exactly to prove Rabbi Yochanan. It must be because while they were evil people, the animals were rejected as being sacrifices. And once they're rejected, they can no longer be brought again. And that's Rabbi Yosef's proof for Rabbi Yochanan. But Abaye comes and says, what do you mean? Someone who dies as an evil person gets their death atones for them. And now he's going to bring a different case, and you can pay attention, though. It's different. This is a case where someone gets punished and gets the death penalty, as opposed to Abaye is going to bring a case where someone just dies naturally while they're a bad person. Now, this raises a complicated question for Kohanim, which is, so he says, "Meit mitoch risho lo havi lekapara." Abaye says, when you die as a bad person, you don't get atoned for. How do we know this? Detane Rav Shmaya. Shmaya brings a braita that says, "Yachol afilu pershu avotav midarkei tzibur yitama." We have a pasuk that says, "A kohen is lo yitama ba'amav." He can't be mitameh to anyone in his nation, but he can be tameh. He can become impure to his close relatives. But then it says, what if his parents left the religion again? What exactly this means? Okay, but good question. But if they left midarchei tzibur, they left from what the majority of people are doing, and they don't really keep religion anymore. You might have thought still the Kohen can be mitame to his father. Talmud lomar be'amav, be'oseh ma'aseh amav. They have to be part of your nation. Okay? If they're not part of, because it said lo yitameh ba'amav, which means, but yes, you can be if they're your relatives, but only if they're your relatives who are part of the nation. Now the question is where do we draw the line? And when can a Kohen not become impure to their parents? And I'm not giving a halacha shiur here, but one can try to look this up and see what the poskim say about this, because it's quite complicated what that means. If your father doesn't do, I don't know what, then the Kohen can't come to his father's funeral, right? We don't really see that go on. So you have to, see where the halacha goes with this. But the simple halacha here sounds like if the father either left religion or something like that, we don't know, maybe less than that, I don't know. Okay, but left from the ways of Darchei Tzibur, then the son is not allowed to be because he's not oseh ma'aseh amcha. He doesn't do the actions of your nation, and that's what it said, be'amav. So what do you see here? If his death would atone for him, then the son would be able to come to the funeral, right, and become impure and bury the body. But it must be death doesn't atone. So comes Rava and says, okay, again, to support Rav Yosef, who tried to use this whole thing as a proof that death atones, and therefore the Ir Hanidacha people, their sacrifices were rejected, not because they're Rishaim, and that would be the obvious, which was what Abaye says. No, it's because they're Rishaim, and they stay Rishaim even in their death. Rav Yosef said, no, they got atonement. So then they're exactly like the person who left religion and came back. It's exactly the same as that, and therefore it would prove the earlier halacha. So Rava says, you're comparing two different things. You're saying a regular person who just dies, who happens to be a bad person, doesn't get atonement. I agree with that. But I'm talking about someone who gets killed, the death penalty. That's a different story. They get atonement. Why is that? Maybe talk risho. So if you die when you're just a bad person and you die naturally, you just died a natural death, lo havi le kapara. A natural death doesn't atone. But neharag mitoch risho, kevan delav ki orche mayit, havi le kapara. But if you die a death penalty, that's an atypical way to die. And an atypical way to die would give you atonement. Kind of like the dragging the bones atones for you, right? Anything atypical would give you atonement. Now he says, Tedan, I'm going to prove it. Mizmor la'asaf, Elohim ba'u goyim elachalatecha. They're reading a Mizmor, and fortunately, this is a very relevant topic. This is talking about people dying al yidei kiddush Hashem, okay, because the enemy killed them. So it says here in the pasuk about goyim came to your nachalatecha, to your where you live, right to or in the temple also. They disgraced your hechal. Natnu et nivlat avadecha ma'achala of Hashemayim. They took the dead bodies of your servants. This is talking to God, and right, the birds ate them, the bodies, and basar chasidecha l'chayoto aretz, and the animals ate the bodies of the chasidim. Now note, there's avadim and there's chasidim. What's the difference between chasidim and avadim? Right, they're all worship God. So my avadecha, my chasidecha. Lav chasidecha, chasidecha mamash. Comes Rav and he says, aren't chasidim the people who were good in their lifetime? And what would avadecha be? Hanach demachayve dina demikara. These are people that weren't so great to begin with, but why are they called avadecha? Came unto ikto kari avadecha, because they got killed. What we call a kiddush Hashem. Someone killed them in an atypical manner, because that's not how normally people die. They would get atonement and they become avadecha. So what do you see here? People in atypical deaths get atonement. And that's Rava's proof. But Abaye is not satisfied with this. Amarle Abaye. He says, wait a minute. You're comparing, okay, we keep talking about what we compare to what. You're comparing haruge mikamidame. Said, right, he uses the same language as Rava. You're comparing this to that. So he says, well, you're comparing haruge malchut la haruge beitin. Turning out I'm a bet. So you're comparing people killed by a different nation, right, to ones killed by the Jewish courts. That's not the same thing. Abaye says, why do Harugei Malchut get atonement? Because they weren't killed according to the law. They shouldn't have been killed, but they were killed because they were Harugei Malchut, and that in itself atones for their sins. Harugei Beitin, kevan shebedin kamikatle. But people killed by the court, they're supposed to be killed by the court because they did something terrible. Lo havi lehu kapara. You don't get atonement. That's what Abaye says. You do not get atoned if you get punished by the court. And Rava thinks you do. And here's Abaye's proof. Teda ditnan. And we're going to use our Mishna as proof. And this is why this whole sugya is here. Lo hayu kovrim oto b'kivrei avotav. Perfect proof. They didn't bury in the father's burial plots. Now, isa kadata kevan de'ikto havi le kapara. If at death they get atonement, then theoretically they should be atoned for. And as soon as you go to bury them, they're already atoned. You should bury them in the burial plot. So likavru, right? If you're going to say, if you're going to say, once they die, right, the killing of him gives them atonement, likavru. And that seems to prove Abaye's point, that clearly people who get death by the court are not atoned for. However, the Gemara is not going to end with Abaye. The Gemara is going to reject this proof of Abaye. It's not clear whether they completely reject Abaye, but they say this doesn't provide you with proof. Why is that? Because the death does atone, but not only the death. You need more than that. And this goes back to what the sugya from yesterday. Mita ukvura b'inan. You need to be killed by the court and then buried. The burial itself connected to, again, with the punishment, the death and the burial is what you need. And that's why you don't get buried in the burial plot of your fathers, because the atonement hasn't happened at that point. The atonement only happens later, which, by the way, we'll see in a minute. But that explains why, in the end, they do bring your bones back to the kever of your fathers, because the atonement does happen over time. So motive, which again proves that the ir hanidacha could be a proof for, okay, if we go back for Rabbi Yochanan statements, because here we have people who's designated animals, then they eventually get atonement, which we'll see exactly when eventually. But when they get atonement, it's too late because the animals were already pushed off. And that basically is where we're up to. So motive Rav Adabar Ava, he says, wait a minute. Lo yumitablim and olanim. There's a problem with our Mishnah, though. If mita and kfura atones, death and burial, then why does it say that they wouldn't have a velut for these people? They can only do aninut and aninut el belev. But isa gadata kevan de ikvor havile kapara liablu. When does the the Shiva start? The Shiva starts after the burial. So if death and burial provides atonement, these people should have, the family should sit Shiva for them. So they say, well, it's not, Mita and Kvura is not enough. You need Mita, Kvura. We're going to have two answers to this question. According to answer number one, Mita, Kvura, and Ikul Basal. You need the flesh to decompose. In other words, it's a process. Once the flesh decomposes, then there's atonement. And how can we prove that? From the Mishna, Daikanami Dikatane, it says in our Mishnah, once the flesh decomposes, then they move it into the Kever Avot. So that's your proof. So that's track one. Track one is death, burial, and Ikul Basal. And then we have a second answer. Okay, Shmamina. So there you can infer from there that since they would move it after the Ikul Basal, there must be atonement at that point. Rav Ashi Amar, Avelud, me'ematai kamatchala, mistimat golel. He says a different answer. Avelut starts when you put the rock on the grave. Okay, there's a machloka Rashi and Tosfot, whether it's on the coffin to close the coffin or whether it's on the burial cave. Okay, so let's just go with Tosfot. It's on the burial cave. You close the burial cave after you put the body in. That's when you get, okay, that's when Avelut starts. And now the question is, when does atonement kick in? Must be after that point, okay? Not as far as Ikul Basal, which is a much later stage, but kapara me'ematai kahavya michichazu tzara dekivra porta. When the body, okay, how exactly to define this is a good question, sees the pain of the ground, okay? This is a little bit of, what we talked about yesterday about the being in the grave, right? Basically brings atonement. So you have to be in the grave somewhat. So in other words, you put the body in, you close the stone, immediately Avelo kicks in, but you haven't achieved atonement yet. You need some time in the grave for the body to be in the grave sometime, which hasn't happened yet. And therefore, we're going to use the same language we've been talking about until now, but in a different context. Since Avelo kicks in right at that moment, and let's say 3 hours later, the body's already been in the ground a little, then you would say the atonement kicks in, but it's too late because the Avelut already didn't start, and therefore it never starts. So, Ihachi, I have one last question here. Lama li ikul basal. So then the proof for the other answer to this question was the ikul basar, and then you move it once the flesh has decomposed. So why do we need to wait to that stage to move the bones? You should move it after those 3 hours or whatever time it must be that it's been in the grave a little bit and atonement is achieved. Well, mishum delo after. That's a technical problem. You're not going to take a body that's in the middle of decomposing. It's disgusting to take that out at that point. The only respectful time to take the body out would be once everything's decomposed and it's just bones. And that's why you would only move it to the Kivrei Avot later, even though the atonement happens earlier. So either which way, we now show that according to at least the Rav Yosef track, which used this source to write, which was all to just show that Rav Yosef was proving from the Irani Dacha case, is that atonement happens with death, burial, and something else. Okay, either a little more time in the grave or perhaps only once all the flesh decomposes, then there is atonement for later on. Okay, these are different approaches, right? How do we know, Becky? You're asking, we don't know. Okay, nobody knows the answer to this question. This is just theories that they had. Okay, now we're moving on to another topic about burial. And we're talking right now about things made for a dead body. Burial spots, the things from the grave are generally asurim b'hana'ah, things that serve the dead body, no one else can benefit from. So now we're going to have a very strange story. Kivrei de Rav, the burial spot of Rav, havushat lemine afra like ishata bat yoma. People had this fever, like it was a day fever, and they would take dirt from the grave of Rav, and they would put it on the people who were sick as a skula for helping cure them. Okay, a little bit strange that they would take dirt from a grave to use for curing. I don't know how that cured, but even more strange, isn't it forbidden to benefit from the dirt from the grave of Rav? So Atu Amrle L'Shmuel, so people came and said to Shmuel, do you know people are doing this? Stop them. Amar Lahu, Yaud Avdin. So it's totally fine what they're doing. Why? Karka Olamhu, because they're taking dirt from the grave. Dirt from the grave is attached to the ground, and Karka Olam Eina Neseret. Parts of the grave that are attached to the ground are actually not forbidden. It's only detached items that are in the grave or that are, using like the shrouds and the coffin and all that you can't use. But things that are part of the ground, like this dirt, is fine. How do I know this? Dictive, well, by Yoshiyahu the king, who also did a big reformation, or did a big reformation in the temple. He got rid of all of the Avodah Zarah. He burnt these asheras. that were used for avodah zarah, and he took the ashes from there. Vayishlachet afra. It says it with an ayin, but they translate it really with an aleph. The ashes, and he scattered it al kever b'nei ha'am. He scattered all the Asherah ashes from the trees he burnt on the graves of the people who worshipped the Asherah, the idol worshippers. So, what do we learn from this pasuk? It doesn't really say what we're looking for. Well, makish gever b'nei ha'am la'avodah zarah. Say we can make a hekesh here between the kever b'nei ha'am and the idol itself, which was the Asherah tree. Ma avodah zarah b'mechubar lo mitasra. Avodah zarah that's attached to the ground is actually not forbidden. We're going to learn this in a minute how we know. Dichtiv asher, and then we're going to say, therefore, also graves are not forbidden, the parts that are attached to the ground, and that proves that what they were doing with Rav's dirt from his grave was okay. Dichtiv. How do we know avodah zarah that's attached to the ground is not forbidden? Well, it talks about the Elilim and the nations you're going to get to and you're going to conquer, and Asher Atem Yoshim Otam, that you're going to inherit their land. Et Elohehem al ha'harim ha'ramim. They're gods, right? These are, you have to get rid of all the idols that are on the high mountains. Now, notice it says that are on the high mountains. We've actually seen the source before. Al ha'harim Elohehem v'lo ha'harim Elohehem. Their gods are on the mountains, meaning you have like an idol on the mountain, but the mountains themselves, if people worship the mountain, that's not called avodah zarah. Okay? That just doesn't come into the criteria because it only says on the mountains, not the mountains themselves. So now we learn hachinami b'mechubar lo mitzar. So likewise, by the grave, anything attached to the ground is not forbidden. Well, now we're going to have a series of contradictions to this, to Shmuel's theory that anything attached to the ground is not forbidden. Metive. Somebody digs a grave for his father, after designating this grave for the father and digging it out, then decides to bury the father somewhere else. No one else can be buried there. By the way, there's a big question nowadays. If you get a burial plot, can you sell it to someone else? Because if it was designated for you, it's problematic. So they say, oh, now, if it's attached to the ground, it shouldn't be a problem, right? It was dug into the ground. So the way they answer this question is, it must be we're talking about an above ground grave and not one that was attached to the ground. Because if it was attached to the ground, and this is the answer we're going to have for some of the other sources, that it's going to be something above the ground and not attached to the ground. There were different kinds, again, without really understanding all the burial traditions in those days and what they were referring to, but there was burial above ground and burial underground. Tashma, another source to contradict Shmuel, kever chadash mutar b'hana'ah, a new grave that wasn't designated for anyone. Someone dug a grave, but not for anyone in particular. So that is permitted because it wasn't designated for anyone. But itil bo nefel asor b'hana'ah. Once you put a child's dead body in there, an infant, then it's forbidden b'hana'ah. Okay, we're going to get back to that nefel tomorrow. We'll leave it right now. But the point being, why would it be forbidden? Right, nefel could be a stillborn, it could be a baby born that dies within the first 30 days. So hachanami bekever binyan. Again, you'd have to say that was only if it was a kever binyan. Okay, if it was attached to the ground, it wouldn't be forbidden b'hana'ah because even if it was a grave of a regular grown person, it wouldn't be forbidden. Tashma, another one. Nimsa ta'omer shalosh kvaroten. Okay, now here we're going to talk about what kind of graves can be moved. So kever hanimtza, kever hayadua, kever hamazika tarabim. We're going to go through all three. Kever hanimtza is a grave that, let's say, you just find in your plot of land, somebody buried, they didn't ask permission. Okay, that kind of grave, since they stole your property, basically, mutar lefanoto, you can move the grave. Pinahu, once you remove it, mikamot tahor mutar b'hana'ah. Two things happen: the land is pure because you took out the dead body, and it's permitted to benefit from because it was never meant to be there in the first place. Kever hayadua, but if someone asked you for permission to bury there and now you just want to move the body because it's in your property, but you gave them permission, this is really any grave, asor lefanoto, you can't move the body. Pinahu, and if you did, mekomotame, where it was remains impure, and asor b'hana'ah, and you can't benefit from it. Now here, it's in the ground. You can't benefit. That's going to be our problem. But we're going to finish the third case. Kever hamaziket harabim mutar lefanoto. If it's a hazard to the public, this really means if it's in the public domain where somebody buried there, and kohanim pass by and they become impure every time they pass by, or people who like to keep pure, we learned about all those, the prushim. Pinahu mekamot tahor, you're allowed to move it. And if you did, mutar lefanoto, you're allowed to move it. Once you move it, mekamot tahor, where it was is permitted, is pure, but asur b'hana'ah, but you can't use that space at all. So again, both that and the previous case, why is it asur b'hana'ah? It's in the ground. So again, they're going to answer the same thing. Hachanami bekever binyan. Okay, it must be above ground. Now they just ask a side question. Bekever hanimtza mutar lefanoto. If I just find a grave in my plot of land and somebody must have, stolen my property and used it, why am I allowed to move it? Dilma mate mitzvahu. Maybe it was a dead body that nobody was dealing with, and that's we call a mate mitzvah, and it's a very big mitzvah, and they can bury it anywhere they want. So a mate mitzvah kanamikomo, once they bury it there, it acquires that space. You can't move it. To which they answer, Shani mate mitzvah dekala ilay. There's no way it's a mate mitzvah because everybody knows when there's a mate mitzvah buried somewhere. They make a big deal about it. Everybody knows, and there's no way it would happen that there would be a mate mitzvah in my plot and I wouldn't know about it. It must be someone stole my property, used it for their dead body, and it wasn't a mate mitzvah. Okay, last thing for today. Itmar, ha'oreg beged lemate. Same idea as before, where I designate there before it was a grave, and then we said again, if it's attached to the ground, anything attached to the ground is not a problem. But if it's above ground, it would be an issue. Now we have, what if somebody weaves shrouds for a dead body, for a dead person? Abaye amar asul, Rava amar mutar. Now they never use the shrouds for the dead person. Abaye says you can't use this for anything else. It was designated just like the grave, designated for this person, can't be used by anyone. Rava says it's permitted. Abaye amar asul hazman milti. He says designating is sufficient. It already means it's for that person. My time. And Rava says, mutar hazmana lav miltahi. Okay, they have this debate, is designating something or not something. Okay, we're going to stop here and we'll see their proofs tomorrow. One proof from Egla Rufa, one proof from Avodah Zarah, and we'll get into all that tomorrow. So let's stop here. We'll do a quick review. We finished all these, the big major question, is the hesped for the deceased or for the family? We finally concluded after 9 sources that it was for the deceased and not for the family. Then we went to not burying Rasha with a tzaddik. We learned it from the Elisha story. Then we had this whole halacha, 2 halachot that they brought in Rabbi Yochanan's name. Rav Yosef tried to prove it from the Irani Dacha case, which all showed that someone who switches, right, goes from one thing to another. Rasha, what Rav Yosef is trying to prove that these Rishaim actually got atonement, and yet their animals can't be sacrificed. That's because of dichoy, which was what Rabbi Yochanan was talking about. Once it's rejected from a sacrifice, it can never be brought as a sacrifice again, even if all the circumstances go back to the way they were. And then we got into a whole debate between him and Abaye and Rava, right? Rava and Rav Yosef on one hand versus Abaye on the other, about whether death atones or not, and which kind of death, and what situation, and then whether mito beitin atone, and that was really our topic. In the end, we said mito beitin with burial, and with something else after burial, not immediately upon burial. Otherwise, we would be able to have shiva for these people, and we don't. Then we got to this kever of Rav. They were taking stuff from. How could they possibly do that? We had a big question with that. And then we ended up saying anything attached to the ground is actually not forbidden. And then we had a question about shrouds that were made for a dead person, but not used by them. Could someone else use them or not? Abaye says no. Rava says yes. We're going to see their proofs tomorrow. With that, we finish for today. Wishing everyone a good day and a good week, and Shema B'Serot Tovot. I know these topics are a little bit, unfortunately, very relevant and present in our lives right now, which I guess sometimes makes the learning a little more relevant, even though it might be a little more challenging.